using our learnings to help us collectively engage around campaigns that are designed to overcome economic injustice and systemic racism. I'm thrilled we are joined here in this program by so many strong partner organizations, and I hope we will continue to build on our collective strength well into the future. For those of you who are new to the Workers' Circle, we are a social justice organization that builds progressive Jewish identity through Jewish culture, Yiddish language, multi-generational education, and all together, we act collectively in campaigns for economic justice, for immigrant and worker rights, and as a partner in the movement to end systemic racism in the United States. As we reach the final program in this presentation of In the Midst, I want to highlight two upcoming programs that I hope you will be interested in joining in the next 2 weeks. On this upcoming Tuesday evening, March 9th at 7 p.m., we're featuring a voter rights program, Bloody Sunday to Today, the fight for the right to vote, featuring a panel of leading voter rights experts and activists. And then on the evening of Wednesday, March 17th at 7:30, we're hosting a virtual civil rights journey to Selma, Alabama, where we will interview one of the marchers from Bloody Sunday, who then became the youngest marcher with Dr. King from Selma to Montgomery. And now back to tonight, the final program of our 3-part series. I want to thank all of you who are joining us now and who have been a part of our learning community for the past 2 sessions. This has been an incredible journey exploring systemic racism through our Yiddish history, activism, and culture. I especially want to thank our producer and moderator of In the Midst, Anthony Russell. He has truly shaped a series that took us into our past and then took us forward to look at issues facing our community today. And before I introduce him tonight, I want to share that the Workers' Circle is committed to continuing programs like tonight's well into the future. So please stay tuned. And now it's my privilege to introduce Anthony Russell. Anthony is a vocalist, composer, and arranger, specializing in music in the Yiddish language. His work in traditional Ashkenazic Jewish musical forms led to a musical exploration of his own ethnic roots through the research, arrangement, and performance of 100 years of African-American roots music, resulting in the EP Convergence, a collaboration with klezmer band Varetsky Pass. An essayist in a number of publications, including Jewish Currents and Moment magazine, Anthony lives in Massachusetts with his husband of 5 years, Rabbi Michael Rothbaum. And it's my pleasure now to welcome Anthony.
Thank you, Anne, and good evening. My name is Anthony Mordechai Tzvi Russell, and this is Report and Reverberation, Fault Lines of Race in the Yiddish Press, the last program of the Workers' Circle 3-part series entitled In the Midst, an exploration of systemic racism in the US through the magnifying, refracting, and reflecting lens of Yiddish culture. As we did last time, we'd like to invite those in the audience with questions for our guests to save them for an informal Q&A session immediately following tonight's program at approximately 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. One of the few pleasures of social media has been the long-standing conversation I've had with various friends and colleagues about historical intersections of Jewishness and Blackness over the past 200 years or so, of which there have been truly a stupendous amount. Some of the most simultaneously interesting, heartening, disappointing, sometimes shocking, and oftentimes inspiring examples I've encountered have been in the context of the Yiddish press and its coverage of race and racism in the United States. Tonight we are joined by our guests, George L. Moss Professor of American Jewish History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he serves as Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. Tony Michels is the author of A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialist in New York, the editor of Jewish Radicals, a documentary history, and the co-editor of the Cambridge History of Judaism, Volume 8, The Modern World, 1815 to 2000. His essays and reviews have appeared in a number of publications, including Guilt and Pleasure Quarterly, Next Book, Heckler, Slate, and Jacobin. Named by the Jewish Week as one of 2020's 36 under 36, an anti-racist educator and writer, native New Yorker, and Yiddish speaker, Jonah Boyarin co-founded the country's first diversity and equity program at a Jewish day school, the Jewish Community High School of the Bay in San Francisco, California. He now serves as the Jewish Community Liaison for New York City's Commission on Human Rights. My welcome to you both. Tony, given the wide-ranging nature of both news and comment in the Yiddish press on contemporary issues of the time, what were its engagements with the subject of race and racism in the United States?
Well, Anthony, thank you for that kind introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. The engagement of Yiddish newspapers and magazines with the questions of racism were frequent, sustained, and remarkably consistent. And by that I mean is that the Yiddish press devoted a lot of attention to the problem of racism in the United States and was consistently quite forceful in its condemnation of racism. And this went across ideological lines. So there are about 5 daily newspapers at the peak era around World War I. And despite the different political differences and different general political differences, when it came to this subject, there was a pretty high level of consistency that racism, and specifically the view was that racism was an endemic problem that had to be confronted.
Thank you. As Americans, we tend to view moments of national attention to social justice issues through discrete periods and events. There's the women's suffrage movement of the turn of the century, the civil rights movement at the mid-century, the movement for gay rights in the 70s, and so on, despite the fact that the visibility of these movements came out of decades of ground-level organizing before they rose to national attention. In each case, despite their respective historic moments, they have required continued protest, advocacy, and organizing to this day. Jonah, I was curious if you could acquaint us with the anti-racism work that you do today, and if you think there are any, what continuities there might be between your work and Jewish engagements with American racism in the Yiddish press.
Thank you, Mordechai Tzvi. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you so much, the Workers' Circle, for having me, and Tony, being here with you. Yeah, I mean, we are so blessed to have this rich history to draw on with all of its amazing resources and all of its warts as well to learn from. Some of the work that I have done, as you already mentioned, Anthony, is in Jewish institutional contexts. I co-founded the first diversity and equity program at a Jewish day school in the country at JCHS of the Bay in San Francisco about 5 years ago. In that context, what we saw was a predominantly white Jewish institution, a predominantly Ashkenazi Jewish institution, where, as everywhere, as in all Jewish communities, there were Jews of color, there were Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, and they found themselves and their culture repeatedly on the margins, and also lacking the proactive empowerment and support that those spaces need to offer in order to be good anti-racist spaces where all people can thrive. So in that context, we worked on thinking from the ground up, working with students, working with adults of color in the building, reaching out for outside resources and help from primarily from leaders of color who've done this work in other schools. What would it look like for our school building to be a place where students were always respectful to each other, regardless of background, where students, different ethnic and racial identities were actively affirmed, where students had an active input into the decision-making of what our school climate looked like. Those are some of the things that we worked on. And so for me, I think in some ways those are new conversations in Jewish communities and very overdue. And at the same time, I really draw on the level of seriousness and commitment that past American Jewish movements of, say, a century ago had to these issues, taking them as life and death issues as they are, and as matters of deepest personal integrity as they are, as a really deep source of inspiration. I'll briefly add one or two other things, which is, there's a lot of different kinds of anti-racist work out there. That's good news for everyone. The bad news is there's a lot of racism that's out there. It's a system that really dominates our day-to-day interactions, from the smallest levels to the largest levels of what we own and how long we live or don't live, et cetera. But the good part of it is, or the good thing that we can do in response, there's no good part of racism, but the good thing we can do in response is there's a lot of different ways to take action. So it might look like in an institution, making it more accessible and empowering for members of marginalized groups, but it also might mean, taking to the streets. I, some years ago, co-organized a national day of learning, fasting, and action in support of Standing Rock. That's, particular campaigns and actions come up where we can come together, tapping into our resources of Jewish communal networks, and also Jewish ideas and texts and traditions, to really be more powerful in our work together. Our work can be as small as changing the ways we show up in our interpersonal relationships, as medium-sized as making our institutions supportive and empowering and centering people of color, and as big as stopping a pipeline that's invading indigenous land. So all of that is on the table. Not all of that is up upon us to do every minute of every day, but it is upon us to figure out what we can do of those things. And I'm here happy to talk about what some of those things are and how they relate to our very rich past.
Thank you so much, Jonah. Tony, I was curious if you could acquaint us with exactly what kind of forms engagement with the issue of racism took in elements of the Yiddish press. Were there articles? Was there reportage? Were there features? Like, in what form did these engagements with the issue of American racism take in the Yiddish press?
There's certainly a lot of articles, a lot of commentary and editorials. Some reportage, maybe more than I realized, because I haven't looked into this systematically or thoroughly, I should say, or comprehensively, because the Yiddish press covers a long period of time. But a lot of Yiddish newspapers, well, I'm not sure how many Yiddish newspapers had correspondence that they could send out to Omaha, Nebraska, or Dallas, Texas, or wherever some outbreak of violence might take place. So it seems to me that a lot of the coverage was commentary more than reportage, but that's just, that's just an impression. I could be wrong about that. But there was a lot of commentary, a lot of columnists in newspapers, and a lot of editorial writers commented on the plight of African Americans, especially having to do with violence, job discrimination, race riots, and that sort of thing. And then there was a fair amount of commentary on literature and culture, especially starting around the time of the Harlem Renaissance. And then there were literary depictions or engagements with African Americans and questions of racism. So a good number of poets and short story writers wrote about African Americans in some way or another. So those are some of the ways these subjects and questions were engaged. And then in more specialized, let's say, union publications, questions of Blacks in the workforce was covered as well.
In an ongoing conversation with friend and academic Eli Rosenblatt, he shared with me a serialized feature in the Yiddish press from about 115 years ago about the dangers of young Jewish women, quote, out partying late with N-words, unquote. It was not even, if the audience will forgive me, the word Schwarzes, but the literal English language slur transliterated into Yiddish. Of course, seeing something like that, there's an automatic reflex to distance oneself from what that represents, to dismiss it as thinking from another time and place, despite the fact that if it's not the time, it's certainly still the place, the context, of course, being the United States. Tony, in what ways did the Yiddish press replicate prevailing American attitudes towards race? And in what ways did it challenge them? Would it have been possible to see both tendencies in the same publication?
Do you know which newspaper that appeared, that article?
I'm actually not saying which publication it was because it's still very much a publication.
I
And I
see.
thought I would actually spare the publication
Publication still
the
exists.
discussion of that particular history in relationship to the publication.
Uh-huh. Can I also ask you the date of that article? Do you happen to know that?
If I'm not mistaken, it was in the teens.
Um, so there was inevitably some replication of larger attitudes, stereotypes, and so forth. I can give you one example I've seen in the Yiddish press, and this is just an advertisement. So you could see an advertisement for Aunt Jemima pancakes, and it was the regular image you'd see, I suppose, in any newspaper with the Yiddish text touting the product. Now, on the one hand, that's not a viciously racist advertisement, but it did reflect racist attitudes about African Americans. So one presumes, I'd presume, that there was some effect on the readers. But readers' reception is very difficult to demonstrate. Scholars spend a lot of time trying to figure out how readers absorb and consume what they read and see. So what I just said was a fairly safe generalization about an advertisement. There was, it was there. There was some image derived from American racism in this newspaper. A lot of readers saw it. It may somehow have shaped how they viewed Blacks. Beyond that, I can't say. That more severe example you just gave, I haven't seen anything like that, but that's not to deny that in any way that it existed. My sense of it, it's not typical when it came to questions of civil rights, violence, and racism, certainly in its more raw forms. But again, there's a lot of research to be done on that subject.
Yeah, Eli and I actually, when we were talking earlier today, conjectured that perhaps there was a shift in the way that people actually publicly referred to Black people after World War I, along with any number of other shifts societally happening at the time. I was curious if you could give me your opinion on what the relationship might have been between writing in the Yiddish press on race and the American Jewish press as an element of assimilation into American culture. Was there a quality that people reading about race in the Yiddish press allowed them to gain knowledge of what it was to be American or what it was to be a member of this culture? What was the relationship between these two things?
Well, the Yiddish press was a crucial agent of Americanization. What Americanization meant was not always an obvious thing. There are various sorts of kinds of Americanization. There are various ways of thinking about Americanization. But absolutely, it's an important, very important medium for understanding how immigrants adapted to the larger society in all sorts of ways. No question about it. It's a very important institution, and maybe more so for Jewish immigrants than many others, because there was a fairly high rate of literacy among immigrant Jews. The overall circulation of Yiddish newspapers ran in the vicinity of 500,000, maybe more. So it's quite important. I'm not sure there's any, most scholars agree there was no other immigrant press that played such an important function in the adaptation of an immigrant community to the country as a whole.
Thank you. Jonah, in your various capacities as a community liaison, facilitator, educator, and Yiddish translator, you've worked both within and without the Jewish community. I am going to quite deliberately step outside of my personal experiences for a moment to ask you, do you encounter patterns of racist thinking in the work that you do, and what have been your strategies to combat them?
Yeah, yes, I do. As I said earlier, I think it's most helpful to think of racism as a system. It's something that is determining, again, from the smallest level of interpersonal interactions to the largest level of how much money we own, how long we live, what kind of jobs we work, what histories we learn or don't learn, what culture gets passed on or doesn't get passed on. All of it really influences every moment of our lives, sometimes in very dramatic ways, and in ways that are very different based on our racial identification. So 100%, how could I not? So, you know, what you're really, and I know you know that, and asking me that, Anthony, and in ways that I don't. So the real question in it is, you know, what does it look like what does it look like for me in my life as a white man who is committed to anti-racist work? And what does the responses look like? And again, racism takes many, many forms, and solidarity takes many, many forms. So for instance, in a school setting, it might look like, you know, I've heard a lot of these stories, both in the work I did in my school, but also in consulting other Jewish day schools. It might be a Black Jewish student at the school getting called the N-word by a fellow white student, someone who thinks that it's like a funny thing to say, not a hurtful thing, out of ignorance and because they've been taught a hateful word and ignorance about the impact of that word, right? So that's an interpersonal instance. Or it might be students outside of a school context, say on Halloween, dressing up in an offensive costume, something that's appropriative, something like blackface or appropriative of Middle Eastern cultures that these students didn't come from. And the school saying, well, what do we do in these situations, right? I mean, so, you know, anti-racist work means not only understanding that those kinds of things are wrong, but also developing systems and practices to respond to them when they come up and figure out ways to prevent them from happening in the first place. So, you know, in a school setting, that could look like having more speakers at the school who speak about experiences of racism so that students start thinking about the N-word in a different way, or appropriation, or having a teach-in for the school the week before Halloween about what appropriation means and what its harms are. It also means training administrators. Say, you know, a white administrator has been doing their job for 30 years and has, as all white people are, has been sort of shielded from thinking seriously about the day-to-day harms of racism, doesn't actually know how serious incidents like these are. And even if they do, doesn't know how to work with a student to do reparation, to do tshuva, to repair those harms on it. So coming up with school-wide systems for when harm happens, thinking about what accountability looks like, what a restorative justice approach that heals as much as possible of the harm that was done to the impacted students, in this case, students of color, or other people of color in the building. So you know, those are forms that it can take. But you know, again, racism is a really big system. So you know, we could also think about in the context of you know, my day-to-day life in the city. You know, I walking around the street, or when I used to ride the subways during regular time, seeing again and again how disproportionately people who were houseless, who needed to ask for money on the street, that's not what they preferred to be doing, it's what they need to be doing, disproportionately how time and again those are Black and brown people. You know, that's racism at work. And as a white person and someone with money, I can walk by that. And that's racism too. And giving a little bit of money, you know, is a thing that I do for my soul to have integrity with myself, but it's not something that changes the structure. It's not something that changes the bigger situation. So thinking about, okay, you know, I learned through Workers Circle recently about some of the amazing work being done in the Fund Excluded Workers campaign. We live in a country where all of the benefits that have gone to workers, COVID-related benefits, unemployment, the one-time stimulus checks, et cetera, they've all gone to people who are documented, who work certain kinds of jobs that are on the books, and have been denied to people like street vendors, like undocumented people, like sex workers. So, there's active legislation getting pushed in New York State to tax billionaires and high-level millionaires and get that money to fund excluded workers. That's good anti-racist action too. So, and if I don't take action on that, if I just take my stimulus check and I don't take action on, if I don't give that stimulus check away to working class or poor people of color or organizations that are fighting for those people, if I just accept that, I am still perpetuating a racist system, right? So it's this really horrible setup where racism is going to be the default. These things are going to be deeply unfair, and we need to take active responses in order to be in any way fighting our complicity, fighting for my soul as a white person, fighting for my integrity within the system. So yeah, it's like sometimes the racism is sort of on the billboard, and sometimes it's just the everyday grinding exploitation and violence against Black and brown people. So what am I going to do about that too? That's showing up every day of my life, even if I could ignore it day to day and week to week. So what am I doing about that too? Both levels call us to action.
So there's aspects of your approach, which obviously involve the educational, in a sense, almost the pedagogical approach to racism. Tony, was there an educational quality to these engagements with racism in the Yiddish press? Was there a quality of them having to, in a sense, explain to populations who perhaps recently arrived or otherwise did not have experience of American modes of racism? Was there sort of an educational quality to these engagements?
I'd say much of the content of the Yiddish press was educational on some level or not. On some level or another, rather. Sometimes it was didactic. Here's what you need to know about America. Sometimes it was simply the education was simply embedded in taking a position on politics or a social issue. The articles I've seen were mostly not didactic. Every so often there was one, but it's mostly one of making a political statement that violence against Black people is horrific. I can think of one more didactic piece. This wasn't in the American Yiddish press. This is something that an American Yiddish writer wrote in a Russian newspaper. It's around 1904. And it was in a series of articles explaining to Russian Jews what America's like. And in the course of this series, the author dedicated a whole section to what he called the Negro question. That term was typical of socialist writers at the time. There was a Jewish question, a Negro question, a labor question, and so forth. And Ronnie. And so he said, one thing that's typifies America is discrimination against African Americans in deep ways. And he just defined it as one of the main contradictions of American society that has to be resolved for the country's own sake. It ran so deep that it was not something that could be papered over or ignored. So that was educational. It was written in a mode that said to Russian Jewish readers, look, if you're coming to America, if you want to know about the United States, this is something you have to understand about the country.
This is very interesting. So the phenomenon of analogies between the historical oppression of Jews and the contemporary plight of Black people in the United States has always personally struck me as being rather complicated, because while they can be a bit reductive in their contents, it's hard to deny that the great emotional response is there when these kinds of analogies are created before their audiences. Tony, were there Jewish identifications with the contemporary plight of Black people in the Yiddish press? And if there were, what was the function of these identifications, rhetorical or otherwise?
This comes out, I've seen it come out really clearly and consistently in the press coverage around the race riots of 1919, Red Summer. when there were riots in, I think, 36 cities against African Americans from, Kansas to Washington, D.C. to Chicago. And this was covered fairly extensively in the Yiddish press. And again, with a lot of consistency. At the same time, there was Russian Jews were being slaughtered during the Russian Civil War, which went on from 1918 to 1921. And the area, Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine, though, there was a veritable bloodbath. So there were those two catastrophic phenomena happening at the same time: mob violence against Blacks, mob violence, in fact, armed violence by militias against Jews. And in that context, it was very common to see race riots described as pogroms. And that had very strong resonance for Jews. It was clearly, that was something every Jew could relate to. They knew what a pogrom was. It was reported almost every day in the press at that point in time. And it was really a strong statement of identification and solidarity. There was the term exile or golis was used to describe the situation of African Americans at that time. They were living in golis, in a state of oppression. And these are some of the terms that were used. Sometimes the term, you'd see a writer refer to Blacks as our brothers in suffering. You'd see that phrase more than once. There was an article in the Chicago Courier, the Yiddish Daily of Chicago, that said, Negroes are treated like Jews and Jews are treated like Negroes. That's what's going on in the United States right now. This was in a context of rising anti-Semitism in the United States, not only the violence I referred to in Eastern Europe. So these kinds of gestures of identification, the terminology, very familiar and emotionally laden terms for Jews were applied to African Americans. And again, these were all meant as expressions of sympathy, of solidarity, anguish, and so forth.
I want to briefly discuss this phenomenon about the use of the word pogrom to describe anti-Black violence in the United States. In the present day, of course, we have numerous contemporary instances where there has been an outcry at the use of terms of historic Jewish suffering in reference to the oppression of non-Jewish others. Even the use of the phrase "never again," which I discussed in our last program on Yosef Kerler, is often considered to be provocative for various reasons if used in context outside of the explicit mention of Jewish communal memory. What has changed since then that has made these rhetorical uses of Jewish suffering in the context of anti-Black violence seem so enigmatic? Like, what has shifted?
I don't know. I'm not sure I can give you a definitive answer there. I would say that probably one thing that determines whether the shared applications of Jewish terms to other contexts, whether that's viewed with sympathy and approval as distinct from anger, probably has to do with the spirit in which that takes place, who's using the terms, whether that borrowing is done in a spirit of sympathy and solidarity, or whether it is used in another way. I would say those are probably the variables that shape the emotional reactions to Jews or any community when it comes to, as I say, use of familiar terminology to another, especially sensitive ones, to another context. But as far as explaining what's changed, perhaps, presuming there has been a lot of change, I'm not sure I'm qualified to say.
Anthony, with great humility, I can comment a little bit in response to that too.
Please do.
It just strikes me that, first of all, the position of white Ashkenazi Jews in America is so different now than a century ago that, it might have seemed sensible back then to identify Black and light-skinned Ashkenazi Jewish struggles as identical. But even in its own time, it strikes me as reductive, right? It's out of a generous impulse of solidarity. But what's interesting to me is also what's different about these different diasporic experiences, about what are the differences between African descended people who were brought to America through forced slavery as part of this forced diaspora, and were this very physically exploited class. And then in the American context, white American Jews, or Jews who were about to become white and Americanized in the coming decades, suffering from all kinds of marginalization, but never being Black in this country, right? My Bubby and Zadie were excluded from a lot more things than I am, but they were also never Black in this country. When my Bubby went and took a bus during Jim Crow era down south, she got to stay on the front of the bus when they crossed the Mason-Dixon line. And so, it seems to me that we're inheriting this rich but troubled history of this kind of identification of saying, what Tony was describing, of saying, it's so incredibly rich to say that Black people were Angolas in this like deep Jewish idea of forced exile and diasporic life that thrives despite the odds. That's a deeply activating and sympathy creating idea. It's also reductive, because what was happening to Black people and light-skinned Jews at the time was different and has diverged so much more in the last century. And, I'll briefly add that today, part of what's at stake is, unfortunately, we're seeing across the board that the terms of who gets to say what's anti-Semitic or not is very, very contentious in the American national sphere. And so particular items from Jewish communal memory, communal suffering, words like the word concentration camps, which both come from the Holocaust, but also, of course, come from the American, white American history of the treatment of indigenous Americans, becomes terribly fraught when being applied to migrant children today, because people are still fighting over the memory of Jewish suffering and what that means for today. So I think, that's part of where those conversations get really stuck, is what do we make of the memory of Jewish suffering? What does it mean about Jewish position today? Are Jews still suffering today? Are Jews still vulnerable? What do Jews owe other groups? What do other groups owe Jews? Those all, come to play in a really sharp way around the trauma of the Holocaust in particular.
I should say something. I may have given the wrong impression. No Yiddish writer ever said that the situation of Jews in the United States was identical to African Americans. There was always a very clear awareness that racism towards Blacks in this country was severe, it was different, it was all pervasive. That's the whole point I was trying to make, that they understood that. The terminology was purely for the sake of emphasizing how bad the situation was for African Americans. That was the point of view. That was the point of using that terminology, Jewish terminology, applied to African Americans. It was to stress that. Yeah.
Tony, I'm very glad you clarified that, because I misunderstood. And it strikes me that part of what I'm doing, you're doing the important work of a historian, which is seeing what was actually said back then. And part of what I was doing in misunderstanding was I was applying the sort of misunderstandings of our time to a previous time. So it makes me think, what you just said makes me think, well, actually what people were saying in the Yiddish press back then in that way was more coherent and more helpful than a lot of what we're saying now. And let us not think that we have progressed, beyond their ideas a century ago, but think in some ways we might borrow from them in this respect.
Sometimes I'd come across articles that were remarkably contemporary in their sophistication. I'll give you one example from a newspaper called Der Tag. The writer said that one of the problems with white Americans is that they have and this is his words, they have a psychology of domination. And he said the psychology of domination is something that accrued throughout centuries of slavery and then Jim Crow. He also said the same exists among Gentiles towards Jews. It's not clear whether he was talking about in the United States or Europe in the context. But that understanding that understanding of racism is being deeply embedded in the mind and mentality of white Americans is something that could have come from W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, both, there's that level of understanding of how serious the problem was, which again does make you wonder about progress. In other words, where did some of those voices go over time?
I can only just imagine what the backlash would be nowadays if a politician got up and used a phrase like a psychology of dominance in relationship to the phenomenon of whiteness in the United States. It really does seem like something very contemporary as far as a way of describing a very real phenomenon. Jonah, I'm curious if you think the evocation of historic oppression against Jews is an effective resource in the anti-racism work that you do. I feel like you've given us sort of kind of a peek as to how effective you think that might be. But what do you think the strengths could be to this approach, and what are the potential pitfalls?
Yeah. I think that the ways that I have suffered as a Jewish person from anti-Semitism and that my ancestors suffered, I would say, far worse, it makes me be a better listener to other marginalized groups' experiences. It makes me want to know. It makes me be able to imagine there's something to be listened to. And I think part of what I had to learn in my own political and personal development was that wasn't the same as knowing, as already knowing, right? Just that having ancestors of mine who were killed in the Holocaust, having ancestors of mine who were sweatshop workers, is not the same as knowing other marginalized groups' experiences. It's a place for me to start and wonder and listen. And I think a big part of what helped me do that was, I got really activated by the Black Lives Matter movement. I had a lot of background in my upbringing to Jewish radical history. I went to Camp Kinderland, which is a summer camp, which from the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, which was very active in anti-racist work, sent dozens of camp members to fight in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, to lay their lives on the line against the fascists and Franco in 1930 Spain. Paul Robeson performed at Camp Kinderland. There was a strong relationship there. I grew up learning about lots of people's movements, but I didn't understand what it was actually like to be a Black American living today. And I'm still very, very much learning. But the Black Lives Matter movements got me out onto the streets, listening to Black leaders talking about their personal experiences with police and other kinds of marginalization, exploitation that I just had never heard directly from in my life. And it was a very different thing to hear those from people living them now than to learn them as my own people's histories or other people's histories. And then to see, large police squads chase us out and try to arrest us, mass arrest us all at once, also changed my understanding of, what happens when Black leaders like this speak up? What happens when Black leaders like this call for the people to show up together? So, I think it has helped me be a good listener, but it's set me up for a long time to feel like I kind of already know enough, and I don't know what to do with it, And I would say that, moving, in addition to understanding past experiences of anti-Semitic injustice, and frankly, contemporary ones as well, I would add two things that I think are really helpful for white Jews like me to do anti-racist work. One is to take seriously for my own self-interest, the moral injury it does to me as a white person living in such a deeply unfair, harmful, everyday, deep down to the level of where people live, how long they live, how much money they make, who they get respect from, how they get talked to, what memories they get passed down to them. Living in a world like that privileges me every day at the expense of Black and brown people is bad for my soul. And I try to take that really seriously. It makes me less of a person, and I'm trying to be more of a person. And I can't change the whole system, but I can change how I participate in it and what I do with other people to change it. So that's one thing, is that, yeah, sure, I'm a Jew. That's a big part of who I am. I'm also a white man in this country, and I need to take seriously my complicity in that, and how I want to reach my integrity. And the other thing that animates me and that I would offer to other white American Jews is actually thinking seriously about anti-Semitism as an issue that we're organizing against. For me, I see very, very deep links between violent anti-Semitism and sort of nationally elevated dog whistling or explicit anti-Semitism, and white supremacy, white nationalism, different forces that are trying to organize this country to be only for certain types of people, either only have white Christian people here or have white Christian people in dominance. So I see those struggles linked in an important way. And I understand analytically that anti-Semitism comes after Jews by blaming us for everyone's problems, right? That's a lot of what modern anti-Semitism is saying, here's a problem that you don't understand or you don't like in your life. Well, they're going to tell you, anti-Semitism will tell you a Jew is behind the bank or the city or whatever it is, the world order, whatever it is, the vaccine, whatever it is that someone doesn't like, they're going to be told that a Jew is behind it. That fuels a lot of anti-Semitism. One of the real ways to address that is to have a more just and equitable world where people's problems are really addressed and we're living with widely shared prosperity with one another. That's a great inoculation against anti-Semitism, because someone doesn't need a conspiracy theory to tell them why they don't have healthcare if they have healthcare. Someone doesn't need it, about why they're getting displaced from their house. They don't need anti-Semitism as an answer for that if they have sustained good quality housing. So, for me, actually, the only way that I'm going to be safe as a Jewish person on the street, God willing, our kids and grandkids for many generations, is if we have this widely shared prosperity in our society.
Amazing words. Thank you so much for that. Tony, were there connections that were made between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in the Yiddish press of the time?
You mean different from the ways in which I was describing them earlier?
I guess I mean potentially the threat of anti-Semitism in the United States against Jews and
Right.
the existing anti-Black racism that was already in the United States. Were there any connections made between these things in the Yiddish press?
I've seen them certainly in the interwar period, where the Yiddish press would identify the same forces that threaten Blacks as threatening Jews, the Ku Klux Klan, American fascist groups in the 1930s and 1940s. So that was something you'd see quite a bit as organized anti-Semitism was increasing between the two world wars. So that was certainly the case. In the communist press, like the Morgenfreiheit, this was a very common theme in the 1940s. The communist line, if you will, was that Blacks and Jews are allies. They're the two most oppressed groups in America. They face many of the same enemies. Let me also qualify what I just said. There's always recognition that African Americans face much worse discrimination and violence and so forth. That was stressed. They were saying what the communist press was saying is African Americans were the most oppressed group. Jews were the second most oppressed group. They weren't setting the two up on an equal plane in that regard. But they were saying, but communists were saying so this is the situation, that they face the same fascist threat, the same racist and anti-Semitic threats, that they are allies in the old-fashioned sense of the term, meaning again, they were comrades, and certainly ought to see themselves that way. And you'd see it all, it was in the Morgenfreiheit all the time back then. So yes, in this era, again, when anti-Semitism in the United States was growing worse, it was becoming organized, yes, systemic. This idea that Jews and Blacks faced the same enemies and had to cooperate was not unusual to see in the Yiddish press.
I think because I don't have a material experience of how things actually were on the ground during the period we are discussing, roughly the first half of the 20th century, it's easy for me to feel sometimes like there was even more possibility for ethnic solidarity then, say in the long 1930s, than there has ever been since. What were the social and political currents at work, both within and without the milieu of the Yiddish press, that gives one that impression? What was at work?
What was going on? What was at work? Let's take the 1930s. In a way, it's the most straightforward and one of the low points as well. So you have the Great Depression at home. Capitalism is in crisis. You have fascism spreading across Europe and gaining a following in the United States. You've got this proliferation of hate groups, some of them violent towards Jews and of course African Americans. And the feeling was that it's not clear what the future of the country was, if you're Jewish. So to give the Jewish perspective, it's not clear where the country's going. Roosevelt is good, thank God he's there, but you have all these threats. And the bars against Jews were rising, the doors were closing, and if the situation for Jews overseas was perilous, and that was the general atmosphere. So then the question is what to do about it, and most Jews who were already on the liberal left of the political spectrum kind of solidified that political orientation. So just to give you a contrast between Jews and white Americans or white Christian Americans, if you were not Jewish, you could respond to the Depression by turning to the right. You could join the Christian Front or, the Silver Shirts or the German American Bund. These are all fascist or semi-fascist groups. You can't do that if you're Jewish. You can't do that if you're Black. There's only one, there's a limited range of responses to the national and international crisis of that time. And that is liberalism, socialism, or communism. That's basically it. Now you can mix into those responses Zionism or Pan-Africanism as particular Jewish or Black responses to the domestic and international crises. But in terms of the parties active on the American scene, it's those parties, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party. And so that was this feeling of vulnerability and insecurity of not knowing where things were getting worse or better. I mean, the looming feelings, things quite probably getting worse. And this tremendous amount of insecurity and anxiety. And so again, it's not just, I should just also stress this, it's not just Jews saying African Americans are our allies, it's coming the other way as well. African American activists of various kinds, newspapers, intellectuals, were also looking to Jews as allies because again, the situation was perilous. So you see a weird situation, just to underscore what I'm saying, is the situation of the Jews was different from every other group that came from Europe at that time, because most other groups experienced a process of integration. What Jews experienced was a process of increasing exclusion during the period between World War I and World War II. They were going, in a sense, in the opposite direction, not in all ways, but if you compare them to Irish Americans or German Americans or Swedish Americans or whatever, they faced, if not the immigrants, their children, their grandchildren were facing anti-Semitism in a way that was unknown to many immigrants who came in the 19th, early 20th century. The Jewish case is different, and that's because anti-Semitism was a variable, and again, one that grew more severe over time, not less, at least up to 1945, 1950. And then things started changing for Jews.
Thank you so much for that. Jonah, I personally like to contextualize the work that you do as an anti-racism educator as the active embodiment of an ongoing process represented by writings against racism found in the Yiddish press. Does the precedence of anti-racist thought and writing in the Yiddish press have any meaning for you personally in the work that you do?
Well, first of all, I'm very flattered by the way you said that, Anthony. And I have to say I'm part of the Yeridas Hadoros, the diminishment of the generations over time, as you might say in Yiddish, because I feel in many ways that I don't live up to the Yiddish, the organized Jewish workers' movements of say a century ago. I said earlier, I grew up going to Camp Kinderland, and there's a plaque there that had the names of the deceased Camp Kinderland alumni who had lost their lives volunteering to fight Franco, to fight the fascists as part of Abraham Lincoln Brigades in Spain in the 30s. And I think about this a lot. I think about a lot of what would it take for me to do something like that. And I haven't yet found it in myself. So I want to say that, you know, I really feel like I'm humbly walking in their footsteps, because a century ago, Jewish workers' movements were far more organized, had far more mass turnout, were far more militant, meaning sort of disciplined, but also personally übergegeben, committed to the work than we are today. And I think we have to have humility about that and try to learn from it. I think that's part of what is so important about the research that Tony has done, is saying we actually have a ton to learn from them. It's a lot of that history has been suppressed from us by the loss of Yiddish, by McCarthyism, which in particular attacked you know, communist Jews and communist Jewish movements. A lot of that's been taken away from us, and we got to learn from that. You know, and yeah, it's, you know, it's a huge inspiration for what I do. And I have the chutzpah to say that there's some things that we can do better as well. That we, you know, it's not just a matter of repeating, you know, revivify the Bund, the Jewish labor Bund, and then we're back to some sort of golden age of Jewish organizing. We actually have learned some new lessons about what to do now that I think are very important. But I feel they must be in a rich, resourced encounter with the past. Otherwise. Well, first of all, it would just be so sad, because it's such a beautiful and strong past that's been really severed from us by these forces of repression and assimilation. And second of all, because we need it so badly. We need it so badly. I mean, I don't know what you all are seeing, but it looks to me like climate change and racism, they aren't going away, they're intensifying. You know, this world is getting more unfair year by year. So we need so badly those lessons of how to take organized, politically insightful, full of integrity, mass political action. That's a big part of our lives.
Thank you so much for that. For a certain generation, myself very much included, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s stands out as the historic moment of reckoning with anti-Black racism in the United States, not just in American society in general, but also through active leadership from individuals and organizations with ties to the greater American Jewish community. This has given subsequent generations the communal narrative of the Black Jewish Alliance, a construction that has personally struck me as a Black Jew as being both useful and limited in its ability to affect real change on the issues it is supposed to address. Yet we have this documented history here of Jews advocating on behalf of racial equality well before the civil rights era, as evidenced by this very program. This is to both of my guests here. What are some new ways of thinking available to us now, both in how we view our history and in continuing to do work towards racial equality in the United States? What are new paradigms that we can have about both our history and the necessity of continuing to do this work?
Tony, would you like me to go first, or would you like to?
Please do. I'm at a loss for words right now.
we'll both struggle to find them, because I find myself too. I mean, I thought about this question beforehand, but I also find myself somewhat. I think partly I am feeling in the moment just the real humility again of knowing that a century ago, my great-grandparents' generation was taking much more effective, concerted mass action than me and mine. And so I do have a certain humility of saying, who am I? One or two things do come to mind. One of the things that actually really inhibited leftist organizing of the 20th century was widespread sexism within the movement. It wasn't unique to the movement, it was a general American phenomenon, but a lot of organizing efforts actually got spiked, and a lot of lives got really hurt through sexual harassment, sexual abuse, the kind of things that we have learned about through the Me Too movement in the last few years, and feminist authors and women have been talking about for far longer than that. Those things were horribly inhibiting to the organizing that was happening and did a lot of harm. And I think, one of the lessons that we've learned is that we actually need a really healthy organizing culture and interpersonal treatment of one another along all of those respects, including gender, in order to make progress. And I think a lot of the work that's happened to help us understand that intellectually has been led in the last particularly 30 or 40 years by Black women. I'm thinking of Bell Hooks as a Black female author who has written really insightfully about how gender, race, and power intersect in lots of ways in our lives and show up both in personal interactions and in movements. And also Barbara Smith, who is one of the originators of intersectionality, of the idea of intersectionality. Is a Black woman who worked deeply in solidarity with white Jews. And it really helped develop some of these ideas of really being attentive to how our individual combinations of experiences change our experiences of systems of oppression, and how systems of oppression will pit and divide people against each other using those kinds of tools.
Tony, are there any sort of correctives that recent scholarship around the subject of Jews and Blacks in the United States, that history, are there any sort of like correctives to the kind of received narratives that we tend to get around issues of Jews, Blacks, and racism?
You know, I think certainly one of the most important books on Jews and race and racism is Eric Goldstein's book, The Price of Whiteness. It's not brand new, but I think what's so important about that book is it explored deeper and with greater sensitivity and subtlety than anything else I had seen, explored the ambiguous nature of Jewish racial identity in the United States, that it wasn't clear what they were. It wasn't clear to Gentiles and it wasn't clear to Jews what they were racially. And he wasn't the first to note that, but it was certainly, I believe that has written the best book on that subject. And I view that as the foundation, as a foundational work for understanding Jews and race in the United States then and now even.
Thank you so much. I will definitely have to read that. In developing this series for the Worker Circle, I designed it with a varied itinerary in mind. The Yiddish press of the 20th century, a Yiddish avant-garde play in Warsaw in 1935, and in 1965, a Yiddish poem on the civil rights movement written in the Soviet Union. The purpose of going to so many places was in order to reveal Yiddish as a language and a culture that itself went many places far beyond its roots and continues to do so today. Those who persist in limiting Yiddish language and culture only to its most parochial associations of an insular Jewishness utterly incompatible with the modern world do so at the peril of reducing it to the obsolescence of a harmless and potentially meaningless nostalgia. The aim of this series, besides providing an embodied space to simultaneously discuss Yiddish culture and systemic racism in America, has been the presentation of Yiddish culture as a potential exponent of modernity, in which addressing the reality of racial inequality is a mandatory responsibility of membership in modern society, both in the United States and abroad. All attendees of tonight's program will be receiving an email shortly with information and resources addressing the issues of this program, in addition to a link to a recording of tonight's program and links to more engaging work from our guests. If you have enjoyed tonight's program, please tell your friends and family and visit us at circle.org. I'd like to invite those of you who might have questions for our guests to remain on this call for an informal Q&A session immediately following tonight's program. My personal thanks to our guests this evening, Tony Michels and Jonah Boyarin, to Jorge Taveras and Danielle Gold, who held down various parts behind the scenes of this series, to our past guests, Elisa Quint, Amelia Glazer, and Maya Ivrona, to Eli Rosenblatt and Robbie Peckerer, whose historical scope has been a profound influence on me, and finally, my thanks to Ann Toback and Noel D'Amico, whose generosity and vision have truly fostered the potential of this series. We look forward to you joining us for two of our upcoming programs. From Bloody Sunday to today, The Fight for the Right to Vote, on Tuesday, March 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern, and Civil Rights Journey to Selma, Stories of Courage and Hope on the Road to Freedom, on Wednesday, March 17th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Jonah, you also have a word of an upcoming event with the Worker Circle, yes?
That's right. Very excited to share that my agency that I work for, the New York City Commission on Human Rights, is partnering with the Workers Circle to present a pre-Passover program called New York is for All of Us, Pre-Passover Community Gathering and Social Action. That's going to be Monday, March 22nd, 7:30 to 9 p.m. All are welcome. There's going to be live music. We're going to be sharing family stories, and we're going to be taking action to support excluded workers.
For more information on this and other events, please visit us at circle.org. Along with Worker Circle CEO Ann Toback, I'd like to acknowledge that this program would not have been possible without the help from our institutional partners and sponsors. Thank you. My name is Mordechai Tzvi Russell, and this has been Report and Reverberation, Fault Lines of Race in the Yiddish Press. Good night. Jonah, Tony, thank you so much. I guess we are now in our Q&A section. I'm going to pass it over to Ann.
Oh, I see.
who's going to take us into that section.
Sure.
Hello, Anne.
Hi, and thank you. And this has been really such a moving discussion and such, I think, a perfect third session combining our history and where we are today. Thank you all. Thank you, Jonah. Thank you, Tony, and of course, Anthony. So I have one of the first questions of the night. I think it's very good, from Herschel Hartman. What were the differences among the Yiddish press from Orthodox to communist on racism and the Black experience? That's probably yours, Tony.
So it's a great question that can't be answered definitively yet because the research hasn't been done. But the best source on this is Hasia Diner's groundbreaking study in the Almost Promised Land. And she found in her looking at Yiddish dailies, almost all of the Yiddish dailies between 1915, I think it was 1935, that they were very similar in condemning lynching and violence, in talking about I just lost my train of thought. In stressing the need for civil rights, for expressing sympathy with the struggles of African Americans, and promoting the advancement and achievement of African Americans. It was another theme in the press. Now, if you look more closely, I'm sure you're going to see more differences. So for instance, and this is something in Hasia's book, the foreword, which was skeptical of Zionism, was also skeptical of Pan-Africanism. It was just skeptical of nationalism. However, the more religious newspapers and the liberal left newspaper Der Tag was very supportive of Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism. So, these differences are bound to, on the more specific level, there's bound to be various differences. In broad strokes, it seems to me, and again, that's based on my research and Hasia's reading, that in broad strokes, we're talking about a similar outlook. The communist newspaper, in a sense, is its own, Die Morgenfreiheit is in a sense its own case, because so much of its perspective was shaped by the Communist Party, not by the editorial staff. And so the newspaper shifted in accordance with the changing perspective of the party. So I think that has to be looked at both in conjunction with all the other newspapers, but also understanding it's a different kind of paper. It was a party newspaper, it was a party organ.
Thank you. I have a question here, and I'm going to tell you, we have so many questions, and I really want to commend everyone asking them. Unfortunately, it's going to be beyond our time frame, but I'm sure we are talking about future programs. So thank you all, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Mark Kaplan writes an interesting question that I think Jonah may have some ideas about. Can one suggest that Jews in the early 20th century understood the suffering of African Americans under white supremacy, but understood very little about African Americans or their culture as such? I want to add to that and ask, could that still be the case?
Yeah, that's a thoughtful question. Thank you, Mark, and nice to see you here on this program, and for the follow up as well with that. And yeah, I do think that's a good point. I'm not a historian. I am, an anti-racist educator and a Yiddish translator. And so speaking from those perspectives, I can say, God, yeah, I've been so disappointed sometimes by Yiddish literature from that era. I pick up a book hoping to find my anti-racist forebears, and instead I find at times, real caricatures of African Americans, of Black life, that perpetuated racism and clearly came out of exactly this kind of ignorance, where there weren't actual, there obviously were instances of it, but there weren't so many lived relationships always between the people, Jewish people doing this organizing work and Black neighbors. I do think that it is a limitation also that of a lot of our organizing work today. And one of the correctives is, you know, and I do think it was one of the insights of our era versus the previous era is really centering experiences and leadership of people of color. In a Jewish context, that could look like non-Jews of color, and it could look like Jews of color. And, you know, I think drawing on the wisdom of a century ago of saying we want to have political alignment, it's not only about identity, it's about we're trying to build towards a shared future with a shared strategy of people, grassroots movement towards widely shared prosperity. But having this insight of, well, if we really do center Black and brown voices in our work, there's things that for me as a white man, I just have a ton of blind spots around that I can get a lot of help with and do more effective work that way.
Yes, go ahead.
A conversation I've been having informally with Eli Rosenblatt of late has been about the relationship between the European-oriented colonial gaze on Black people in America and how that might have been inherited by Jews who were coming from Eastern Europe, who might have acquired elements of this gaze in relationship to viewing Black people, and how there are elements of that that make their way into these kind of literary and artistic engagements with Black people and with Blackness. But again, that's something that you know, people are doing scholarship on now. It's not necessarily the most developed concept as far as talking about the relationship between Yiddish culture, Yiddish-speaking people, and Black populations in the United States. I don't know, Tony, if you have any input around this particular issue.
I just echo what you said, that the research on this is still quite new.
Interesting, and a great question. I did want to add a question from Bob Karp. Were racist practices in labor unions ever written about in the Yiddish press?
In trade unions generally, yes. So the predominantly Jewish unions stood much further to the left than most unions in the United States prior to the 1930s. There was lots of conflicts and tensions between the predominantly Jewish unions, which were socialist unions, and most of the American Federation of Labor Unions, which were anti-socialist. One of the issues of conflict and tension was the Jim Crow practices in a good number of trade unions. The so-called Jewish unions, the garment unions, became integrated unions very early on in the 1920s, when large numbers of African Americans and Puerto Ricans were moving into New York City or further to other cities in the upper Midwest. They joined the ILGWU, for instance. So those became integrated unions pretty quickly. Now, it's not to say there's absolute equality in those unions. There wasn't gender equality either, as Jonah referred to. But on the very important point of whether African-American workers were allowed into the union or not, they absolutely were. So the Black membership grew significantly in the 20s and 30s. And then, and this is something that Daniel Katz, the historian, has written about, the ILGWU was one of those predominantly Jewish unions that celebrated Puerto Rican and African-American culture. They had cultural programs and pageants that did that. Also for Italians and Jews. It was a multiculturalist approach to trade unionism. So what I'm describing is two things. One, a criticism of the racist practices that were common in American trade unions up to the 30s and beyond, but also an affirmative approach to organizing African Americans and Puerto Ricans.
Interesting. Anthony, do you see this question from Dan Opatashu? I think you and Jonah have both written about how the use of the word, I'm going to make sure, I hope I don't mess up the Yiddish, but neger is the Yiddish translation of the English Negro in all dictionaries, Schwarze was the racist pejorative. And he asks, am I mistaken? And I think actually it's an opportunity for me to ask all three of you to speak to how Yiddish press used language to refer to race, and whether it was pejorative in many instances, or, well, just give us some sense of how that worked.
So that has been, it's my understanding that Dana Opatashu is right, and that the word neger was used specifically in, it was the word Negro basically in the Yiddish language, and that the word Schwarze or Schwarzer was, of course, the pejorative word that was used, kind of a password in a sense, to sort of establish a group of people as being separate from one's white Jewish self. I wrote about this, of course, to some degree, along with great assistance by Jonah Boyarin for Jewish Currents in an article last year. But there's more sort of scholarship coming out about these sorts of registers that existed in the Yiddish language as far as talking to people, talking about people in racial terms.
If I could just add to that, I concur. The word neger meant Negro. Schwarze in the Yiddish press usually just meant black, although the connotations could be ambiguous sometimes, and it certainly became pejorative as a second generation of American-raised Jews used it in pejorative ways. But there's a third term you'd see in the Yiddish press, and that is Schwarze Menschen, which is not pejorative at all. It simply means black people. So now some of these are, of course, neger is by now outdated. So even
I
though,
mean, in as much as like Negro is also outdated.
for the same reason, right?
Right.
Wow.
Mhm.
It's such a language has been such an interesting theme in our 3 sessions, and of course continues to be a really interesting theme for all of us to think about. I mean, both in English, Yiddish. I think languages, the words matter has become really a talking point in itself. So I find it interesting carried over here. I see we're at almost 8:25. What do you think? Are we? Should we take one more? Or
Take as many as you want.
okay.
I have goldfish here from Pepperidge Farm, so
I've been looking at a lot of different I like this. I am a bit inclined toward the labor history as the Workers' Circle CEO, and I'll say from an anonymous attendee, my grandfather, a union guy like this grandson, said that he met many Black Americans at either the Workmen's Circle, now of course Workers' Circle, or the Socialist Party meetings, including A. Philip Randolph. Is this accurate? And how did the Yiddish press deal with this a history of both inclusion and perhaps exclusion in the union movement?
A. Philip Randolph was a hero, the most important Black trade union leader in his generation, and he had very close relations with Jewish labor leaders in the socialist movement, in the Socialist Party movement. He was A. Philip Randolph was a Socialist Party guy, and so that letter writer's memory is correct. That's there were very close ties. So he was leader of the International Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, I believe an all-Black union, a very important union, and that's where he was president of that union. Also an important civil rights organizer, and he worked very closely with the major Jewish labor organizations.
I will share that there was a room in our old Workers' Circle building on East 33rd that had photographs of our heroes, and A. Philip Randolph was there. I'm thinking perhaps he was actually in that room, which certainly gives me pause and respect for the room. There's an interesting, yes, go ahead, Jonah.
There's one that I'd like to answer.
Oh,
if I
please.
could volunteer myself.
Great.
Okay, good. So this is a good kasha, which in Yiddish means a very challenging, difficult question. And this comes from Herschel Hartman. Jonah, aren't Jewish day schools fundamentally segregationist, allowing students to avoid integrated public schools? So, first of all, private schools are segregationist. It's not a Jewish day school issue or something, but private schools are segregationist, both in terms of the demographics of disproportionately white and class privileged people they pull out, but also the ways that they divest in public school systems, right? So they end up hurting poor and working class and disproportionately Black and brown students. That's true in the American context. So I hear you, Herschel. And I think in terms of our political imagination, this is part of what I think is so rich and important about connecting to Jewish radical past. Shimon Dubnov, who was a historian, he perished in the Holocaust. He was a socialist Jewish historian in Eastern Europe. And he was also a political thinker. 100 years ago, suggested the idea of we can have a broadly multicultural, in fact, multinational socialist democracy where we're all living in the same country together, but every group has certain amounts of enough autonomy to be able to live on in their cultures and ways, to transmit things like Yiddish-language or Jewish people's history, or for another group, it might be Spanish or Mandarin, or the histories of the various diasporas from those places, and the workers' struggles from those places, and the songs and culture, et cetera. Those are the kinds of things he was envisioning. That is very far from the system that we have in the States, right? As Jews have made the decisions, very, very different decisions, depending on which community and which individual Jews, about how do I navigate continuing Jewish culture? What's the school that I send my child to? What's the community that I'm part of? What parts of the culture do I want to transmit? We have made those decisions in the context of a dominant system that does not care about minority cultures, and a dominant system that is going to push the most privileged to private schools and divest in all the rich diasporic, indigenous, Black and brown, ethnic traditions that really deserve to breathe to life. And Jews we don't have enough power in this country to create Dubnov's vision. We can't just create a whole schooling system across the country where people can go and learn about their own people's traditions, but also be in public school with their neighbors from different traditions. We don't have the power as American Jews to do that. The only way we could do that is mass people's movement with other groups who are also invested in, in Black children being able to learn Black history, in Dominican children being able to learn in Spanish about their people's history, et cetera, et cetera. If we work together, then we can maybe make that kind of system where we don't have to make these false choices between having Jewish spaces and Jewish learning, but have them also be in this more segregationist model.
I briefly have one question that I would like to take. An anonymous
Please.
attendee has asked that we please refrain from using the term white privilege and the fact that it is divisive and reactionary. I would like to remind people that I am the producer and moderator of this series, and that the guests who I've brought in this series to talk about subjects which I have chosen are here under my association. And while I always appreciate feedback on what we happen to be doing here, I'm afraid this is not a space for dictating to either the moderator or the guest the terms under which they discuss these subjects, which I personally have chosen for us to discuss. And that is all.
I'm going to ask one other question, and then if from the questions, and then if maybe you want to have some closing comments, and I do want to really commend Herschel Hartman. He has a lot of great questions. If only we have to, we'll certainly capture all those questions and consider them for future conversations. Diana Scott, who is another California Workers' Circle leader, all she says is secular Jewish leftists ? It led me to want to ask you, how does the Yiddish press treat secular versus religious, and if that intersects with racism historically through today, but really historically? I'm curious about the secular versus religious question. Tony?
I'm trying to muster.
He's chewing on his goldfish.
My goldfish, trying to come up with a succinct answer.
I know.
Let's say the issue of religion versus secularism was very, very hot in the late 19th century up to World War I. It became less so most segments of the Jewish community, even the left, after World War I. It seemed a little dated. Orthodoxy didn't seem to be much of a threat to many by then. Some secularists began to see value in religious traditions. The main exception here, I would say, in an organized exception is the communists, who at times still retained real strong hostility to religion, but other times did not, depending on the shifting line. So that's my short answer. I think probably where the question by the 1920s became most pertinent, meaning the question of religion versus secularism became most pertinent, was in the secular schools for children, because then there's a question of content. What do you teach the children? Do you teach religious holidays? If so, which holidays? How do you teach those holidays if you're secular? So the issue was alive. It didn't go away. I don't mean to suggest it didn't, but I think it became most pertinent in questions of education in the secular schools. That's something of an answer, Diana.
And may I add something as well, Anne?
Of course.
So I'll say, as an observant Jew who also grew up in Camp Kinderland and these more secular traditions, so drawing on both, I want to share a story about a largely today unknown instance of Orthodox Jewish radicalism.
Oh, yeah.
And here I'm drawing on the research and writing of my friend Alan Lipson, who's a rabbinical student at Hebrew College and a former labor organizer with Unite Here. And Alan writes about a Rabbi Bick, who was a yeah. Can I hear an amen from the audience?
Amen.
Rabbi Bick, a Polish-born Orthodox student of Rav Kook, immigrated to America and founded a flourishing progressive yeshiva on the Lower East Side, the Institute for Jewish Studies. A yeshiva is a traditional academy of learning. The Institute for Jewish Studies, which at its prime in 1947 boasted 400 students and courses such as the Jewish people under capitalism, imperialism, and socialism. And unfortunately, the House of Un-American Activities Committee soon stopped the project in its tracks. They summoned Bick and he pled the fifth on a barrage of trumped up charges, including teaching, well, because he had taught at the Civil Rights Congress, a left-wing legal advocacy group for unjustly accused Southern Blacks. And he had served on the board of a Workmen's Circle summer camp.
That is so interesting. I mean, we've been radically secular since our founding, but inclusive.
There you go. So
at least in as many instances, and of course, that isn't always the case. I know I'm foreseeing some of the Q&As. Look, I said it last time. we have a complicated history, but it's interesting to hear. And it sounds like this is a story that bears investigation.
I'm so glad you mentioned Rabbi Bick. I'm fascinated by him. In fact, not long ago, I read a treatise that he wrote in Yiddish in 1938 called The Religious Principles of Socialism. He was very left, very far to the left. He was quite radical and very prolific. He wrote, I have about 8 of his books that he wrote.
Tony, what are you doing keeping all that to yourself? Send it along, translate it, and send it along to me in the original, please.
I got to tell you, this guy, I predict, is going to be the subject of some studies in the coming 10 years. He's really fascinating.
Well, I'm hoping that we'll actually get a chance, if that happens in the coming years, to be able to talk about that in this setting. As a kind of a close, us at the Worker Circle are actually considering a subsequent program where we bring back all of our guests from this series in order to address some of the questions we didn't have time to cover over the course. That's far in the future, so you don't have to be worried, Tony. It's not happening next week. But I really want to thank you, and I want to thank you, Anne, for moderating this, and to all of our guests and everyone who worked behind the scenes as far as creating this program for the Worker Circle. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And
Anthony,
thank you.
On all of our behalf, thank you. This has been a groundbreaking program for us, and one that I know is going to carry us forward into many more conversations. And Jonah, we will be present for many more activist picket lines and actions. So thank you all. You're inspiring our future.
Thank you.
Thank you to the audience for sticking through with this entire series. You know, we're living in a time where even, you know, our pleasures look so much like work, especially if they happen on Zoom. So I really want to thank everyone out there in the audience for joining us on this journey.
It's wonderful, and we have a worldwide audience and clearly a nationwide audience, many people from the West Coast. Thank you for joining us and really contributing so much. So it's been all of our pleasure.
And again, thank you to all of our sponsors and joining institutions who have been able to get out the word about this program. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
All right.
Good night.
Thank you. Sexism. Be well.
Sexism.